Is this thing on? It's my final video on my aggression series. It is a book review. And this book I think is a good book to sort of neatly wrap up the series because it combines sort of economics with politics with a little bit of cultural psychology as well. It is Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. Acemoglu is a MIT economist, and he's been an economist at MIT for over 30 years. And then Robinson, at the time of the book was published, was a Harvard professor, but now is a professor at the University of Chicago in the field of political science. So this book I highly recommend. It's one of probably the best consumable comparative politics books, which comparative politics is sort of a field of politics that tries to explain whether it be certain political instances of inequality, of violence, of statecraft, of how the world works, essentially, is what comparative politics tries to understand. And this book sort of tries to present a thesis by sort of scouring through historical events, particularly world history, post 17th century, but even before that, but 17th century to 21st century, so over 400 years of history there, and determining sort of what happened in the evolution of prosperity within the world, and how there was inequality in the world. And their fundamental thesis is not they reject concepts of culture, and they reject concepts of geography as sort of being the main factors for how nations became powerful, and how nations became economically prosperous. The primary thesis that they lay out is it's their political and economic institutions within the states. And how they contrast it is they lay out sort of feudalist, absolutist, colonial regimes in nations that sort of were colonized, often had extractive political and economic institutions. Typically, the extractive economic institutions precipitated the extractive political institutions, and once basically those countries became more extractive, then they became sort of less prosperous over time. Whereas countries that embodied inclusive economic and political institutions then also sort of became more prosperous and allowed markets and developed quicker. So it's not necessarily saying like capitalism is all that great or socialism is all that bad, but it is saying that sort of the history of development is tied mostly to types of political and economic institutions in the nations. And so I'm going to go over a few quotes here. I'm going to get a little bit more in depth in the Substack. So the first one I'm going to go over is lack of creative destruction and innovation is not the only reason why there is severe limits to growth in extractive institutions. The history of Mayan city-states illustrates a more ominous and alas more common end, again implied in the internal logic of extractive institutions. these institutions create significant gains for the elite, there will be strong incentives for others to fight to replace the current elite. Infighting, instability, and thus inherent features of extractive institutions, and they only create further inefficiencies, but also reverse any political centralization. So this is sort of the fundamental argument against extractive institutions. And sort of how they define extractive institutions is sort of when power, political power and economic power is concentrated into the hands of a few, and sort of in terms of sort of economic ideas, this has been done both in capitalism and in socialism. And sort of even if you want to argue communism, you're gonna be saying that the state shouldn't exist, but the thing is that then you have a lack of centralization, and a lack of centralization also impacts prosperity, because a lack of a central state means that there's less legitimacy in enforcement of sort of norms, of virtues, of values. And so you need, to some degree, centralization of the state, but you also want that state to be inclusive. You want that state to be pluralistic. And fundamentally, it also, the reason why sort of institutions become extractive is fear of creative destruction. What that means is sometimes there is going to be losses, but overall, over time, when a culture is inclusive, it allows for technological change that only makes them more prosperous over time. The next quote deals more with inclusive institutions. The Glorious Revolution involved the emergence of a new regime based on constitutional rule and pluralism. This outcome was a consequence of the drift in English institutions and the way they interacted with critical junctures. So, going back, at critical junctures are points in history where the sort of decision makers of the day, the people with political power, economic power, they decide either to become more extractive or more inclusive. And one of the key features of inclusivity to the authors is pluralism. Pluralism means allowing people who may not have sort of the same outlook, allowing them to participate economically and politically. That's sort of what the fundamentals of pluralism means. Allowing people who either have different religions, different skin color, different identity to participate economically and politically. That doesn't necessarily mean sort of changing all the laws to accommodate their every single need, but allowing them to participate at least gives them the idea that they can shape policy and they can have more of a say in the outcome of their lives. Sort of the inverse of that leads to aggression, because then it just leads to more infighting. And that's sort of fundamentally what is the contrast with extractive political and economic institutions. And then the last quote I'll be going over in the video is related to world inequality and how to solve it. Sort of the modernization theory, which some might argue that this book is trying to argue for, is sort of making cultures, making countries that were former colonies to become democratic and to become more capitalist. the thing is that what they're arguing here is that it would only work if the institutions themselves, the political and economic institutions themselves, embodied inclusivity. So the argument is creative market failures will also prevent implementation of interventions to improve incentives at the micro level. Attempting to engineer prosperity without confronting the root cause of the problems, extractive institutions and politics that keeps them in place, is unlikely to bear fruit. So this is sort of talking about foreign aid and talking about sort of a lot of like sort of post Cold War and even during Cold War sort of loan processes were tied to conditions that those countries become more capitalistic, those countries become more democratic. But if the people with power are still living and sort of maintaining extractive political and economic institutions, those institutional changes won't occur, and then they'll just be getting sort of supported by whatever loan processes that they receive. And so what this book fundamentally is generally a good defense for those who sort of still subscribe to liberal internationalism, but with a different flavor. It's not necessarily going to be a flavor that says all these institutions are going to change the world. These international institutions are going to change the world. It does place a lot of sort of onus on the domestic politics. And so how this book relates to aggression. So I've been talking about sort of themes on ways in which political ideologies try to address aggression, and sort of some argue the root cause is scarcity, but the thing is that I think aggression is more than just material. It can also have sort of emotional and other sort of spiritual implications in aggression. And what this book addresses sort of is sort of on the macro scale, ways in which aggression just begets more aggression through the institutions of extraction as opposed to inclusivity. Anyways, these are just my thoughts. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for your time. The next series is going to be on Christian ethics. And I will see you in the next one.